good evening, or perhaps good night. Wherever you are, as the sky outside grows dark and still, I want to welcome you. You've found your way to a quiet corner of the world, a resting place, a space made only for you. Tonight, there is no rush, no need to solve, to strive, to fix. The weight of the day can fall away now. You've done enough. So take a deep breath, slow and steady, and feel the surface beneath you, the shape of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket, the heaviness of your limbs. Gradually letting go. Let this be a soft place to land. And if you feel so inclined, I invite you to join others who pass through here. Leave a little light behind in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, and when you've arrived in this moment. Is it a stormy dusk, a restless midnight, a fragile morning? Wherever you are part of this quiet. You are welcome here. And now, let us drift back in time. Far back, before screens, before steam, before the world was lit by more than the moon. Back to a time when illness crept in like fog, when people didn't understand sickness, but they feared it, and they fought it in the only ways they knew how, with herbs, with blood, with ritual, and with faith. This is the story of healing in the Middle Ages, a slow, strange journey through ancient remedies, some painful, some beautiful, all of them deeply human. So close your eyes if you haven't already. There's nothing to see now, only to listen, only to rest. To understand how people once healed, you must first understand what they believed. And they believed in balance, not just in the body, but in the stars, in the seasons, in the soil beneath their feet. Everywhere they looked, they saw cycles, turning, tipping, repeating. Day and night, winter and spring, sickness and health. They believed the body worked the same way, that within each person were 4 essential fluids, called the 4 humours, and that these ruled not just illness, but everything. They shaped how you thought, how you felt, how you moved through the world. The first was blood, bright, red, warm. It lived in the heart. It gave you vitality, energy, joy. Too much blood, they said, made a person too eager, too indulgent, too flushed with desire. Then there was phlegm, thick and pale, the humour of winter, of snow, of silence. Phlegm cooled the body, calmed the spirit, but in excess it made a person slow, forgetful, even dull. Next came yellow bile, bitter, hot, sharp as fire. It brought courage, willpower, and drive. But too much yellow bile, and the mind grew quick to anger. It ruled the liver and burned in the gut. And last, there was black bile, heavy, cold, and dry. It gathered in the spleen. It gave a person depth, thoughtfulness, artistry. But when unbalanced, it could sink the soul. Melancholy, a weight that words could not lift. Each of these humours had a place. Each had its purpose. Health meant harmony. Illness meant imbalance. A cheerful person was said to be sanguine, ruled by blood. A cold and analytical one, phlegmatic. A fiery, driven personality was choleric, full of yellow bile. And the quiet, poetic soul was melancholic, drawn downward by black bile. So medicine wasn't just about symptoms. It was about temperament, season, diet. It was the art of reading a person as if they were a poem. If your skin was pale and your hands were cold, it meant too much phlegm. You'd be given heat, mulled wine, warming spices, woolen blankets layered with thyme and sage. If your face was flushed and your eyes red, you had too much blood. You'd be bled, gently, a shallow cut behind the ear, a bowl beneath your arm, not to harm you, but to restore order. Yellow bile called for bitterness, roots that curled the tongue, tonics made from vinegar and sour wine. Sometimes you'd be made to vomit, to rid yourself of fire. And for black bile, the heaviest of them all, you'd be taken to nature, walks in the woods, the sound of wind in the trees. You might hear music, a familiar voice, the scent of lavender placed near your bed, and above all, prayers. Because healing meant restoring harmony, and harmony was sacred. They didn't treat the body like a machine. They treated it like a garden, a landscape to be understood, nurtured, watched with care. This was their medicine, a blend of earth and spirit, of breath and belief. And somehow, in the quiet dark of centuries past, it often helped. Imagine a healer standing over a sick child. They don't reach for a stethoscope. They ask instead, "What did he eat yesterday? When did the coughing begin? Was the wind cold last night? Was he sleeping under a full moon or a new one?" Because every detail mattered. The body was not a closed system. It was open, affected by stars, seasons, emotions, and air. To heal it was to observe its rhythm, to align it again with the world around it. Diet, too, was tailored to the humors, not by counting calories, but by sensing qualities. Bread, beans, fish, cheese, each was warming or cooling. Some were moistening, others drying. Every meal a medicine or a mistake. If your temperament was hot and dry, perhaps choleric, then cucumbers and milk might be given. If your humor was phlegmatic, sluggish and cold, you'd be told to eat spiced meats or strong wine. Sweetness might soothe a melancholic heart, while bitterness could purge a restless mind. Seasons shaped the body too. Summer stoked yellow bile, winter thickened phlegm, spring roused blood, and autumn brought black bile to the surface. Healers understood this, or believed they did. They memorized ancient texts from Galen and Hippocrates, copied by hand in candlelight. They read them in Latin. They studied diagrams of humors and planets, believing the heavens reflected the state of flesh. A healer was not only a caretaker, they were an interpreter of signs, of winds and dreams, of pulses and color. They didn't ask only what hurt. They asked when it hurt, where the moon was, which direction the breeze blew through the window that night. They watched the tongue. They smelled the breath. They even tasted the urine, looking for sweetness, for sourness, for imbalance. This wasn't strange. This was knowledge. This was care. There were charts for everything. What herbs to give if the liver ached under a waning moon? What root to grind if blood was hot and restless in the early spring? Even dreams were considered. If a patient dreamed of fire, it might indicate too much bile. If they dreamed of water, perhaps phlegm was in excess. Healing was personal. No single cure suited all. There were no standard doses, no identical prescriptions. Instead, there were layers of meaning, careful questions, a deep respect for the mystery of the body. And so the healer's day began not with action, but with stillness. They watched, they listened, they waited. A man complaining of weakness might be offered broth laced with nettles. A woman with headaches might be told to avoid salted meats and stay indoors when winds were high. A child with fear in the night might be anointed with oil and soothed with lullabies passed down for generations. And when no single cause could be found, when the symptoms defied order, they turned to combinations. A tea of mint and fennel and honey, a poultice pressed to the chest, a soft song sung while the mixture cooled, and always a prayer. Because healing in the Middle Ages was not only practical, it was sacred. To be ill was to be imbalanced, physically, spiritually, even cosmically. And to be healed meant not just feeling better, but being restored to one's place, to one's pattern, to harmony with the world. It is easy now to look back and judge, to scoff at leeches and bleeding bowls, at chants and symbols and prayers whispered over steaming cups. But they were not foolish. They were observers of their world. They noticed patterns. They remembered what seemed to work, and they shared that memory across time. And within all of it, beneath every boiled root, every pressed leaf, every warm compress, was a deep, unshakable hope that the body could find its way back, that the soul could settle, that breath would slow, and that peace, however brief, was possible, even in the darkest nights, even with the faintest tools. That belief was medicine too. When illness came, it came quietly, a chill in the limbs, a weight behind the eyes, a feeling that something unseen had shifted just slightly out of place. There were no thermometers, no machines, no clinics, charts, or sterile gloves. There was only the home, the hearth, the memory of remedies passed down in whispers and gestures. The first treatment was rest, true rest, the kind that meant silence, stillness, and surrender. A straw mattress moved near the fire, a damp cloth cooled with rosewater folded over the brow, a cup of something warm, held gently, sipped slowly. Then came the herbs, tied in bundles, hung from wooden beams, stored in clay jars, brittle and dry. They were chosen not by chemical composition, but by nature, by warmth, by moisture, by energy. Fever, willow bark and meadowsweet, gentle coolers, a troubled stomach, fennel, mint, anise, restless nights, chamomile tea, or, for deeper sleep, valerian root. When the breath grew short, the chest tight, boiled thyme, sage, and a touch of horehound in honeyed wine. If the voice was lost, licorice in goat's milk. Appetite gone? A bitter wormwood infusion to stir the body back to hunger. These were the soft remedies, the nurturing ones. But if they failed, harsher measures were taken. Mustard seed paste, hot and sharp, pressed against the skin to draw out heat. Vinegar-soaked cloths wrapped around arms and legs. Slices of onion tied to the soles of the feet to draw illness down into the earth. For toothaches, the cures ranged from clever to cruel. Chew a clove to numb the gums. Rinse with sun-warmed urine. Grind the bones of a burned mouse and rub it into the gum line. And if nothing worked, you went to the blacksmith. Tooth removal was not gentle. The same iron tongs used on horseshoes were used on humans. The pain was immense. Relief came only from wine and willpower. Afterward, the empty space might be packed with ash, salt, or spider webs to prevent infection and bleeding. For injuries of the flesh, burns, cuts, broken bones, remedies could be surprisingly effective. Wounds were washed in wine or salted water, bound with cloths soaked in egg white or goose fat. Honey, too, was a common salve, not for sweetness, but for its power to resist rot. Dried moss, plantain leaves chewed into paste, spider webs gathered from rafters and pressed into wounds. Bones were set by feel, splints made from branches. Wrapped in linen, the patient told to lie still and trust that the body knew how to heal itself. There were stranger cures, too. For joint pain, sleep beside a dog. For nosebleeds, a knife placed beneath the bed, blade facing up. For nightmares, a clove of garlic under the pillow or a dried lizard above the door. Each region had its customs. In one village, illness was thought to begin in the eyes, so herbs were burned until the smoke made tears fall. In another, The air was blamed, so bundles of flowers were worn around the neck, rooms fumigated with burning sage or rosemary. If a family had coin, they went to the apothecary, a place of wood and shadow, drawers filled with powders, jars of dried roots, bones, beetles, stones, ambergris, saltpeter, crushed pearls, toad skin, burnt horn, ground coral. The apothecary would listen, nod, then begin to mix, by instinct, not instruction. Every remedy was unique, every preparation done by hand. Some treatments were not for the body alone. If a person wept in sleep, spoke to unseen things, or wandered in confusion, then other cures were needed. Prayers written on vellum and worn near the heart, holy water behind the ears, a bell rung beside the bed. Sometimes a mirror was placed facing the patient, to confuse the sickness, to reflect it away. In the countryside, help came from the quiet ones, the herb wives, the bone setters, the grizzled man with a crow on his shoulder, the woman with a basket full of roots and no surname. They didn't study in universities. They learned by watching, remembering, tending. And when their patients healed, it was not only the plants they thanked, it was the hands that stirred the broth, the voice that stayed in the room, the quiet figure who sat beside the fire through the longest night. Medicine was messy, uncertain, frustrating, tender. Even the strangest cure, a leaf under the tongue, a charm whispered over steaming tea, meant someone still believed in you, that you were worth saving, and sometimes that hope alone was enough. And still, some remedies wandered even farther, into the imaginative, the desperate, the odd. For joint pain, one might be told to sleep beside a dog, trusting in its warmth and calm to draw the swelling out of the body. Others believed in passing an egg around the affected limb and then burying it beneath a hawthorn tree, symbolically transferring the pain into the earth. If a nosebleed persisted, the answer might be to place a knife under the bed with its blade pointing upward, cutting the bleeding from below as though illness could be severed like thread. Some healers recommended pressing a cold key to the back of the neck. Others advised tying a red thread tightly around the left thumb. And for nightmares, those relentless visitations of the mind, there were strange comforts. Garlic under the pillow, a dried lizard nailed above the doorframe, laurel leaves placed beside the bed to ward off malicious spirits. Some whispered charms into bowls of water, which were then left on window sills to catch the wandering affliction before it slipped indoors. Beliefs varied from region to region, shaped by soil and superstition. In some towns it was said that illness began in the eyes, so dried herbs were burned and the smoke waved before the face until tears came. These tears, they believed, carried the sickness away. In others, the danger was thought to linger in the very air, so people carried pouches of dried flowers close to their hearts and burned bundles of rosemary near every threshold. If someone could afford it, they might visit the apothecary, a cramped, shadowy shop tucked into a corner of the village or city. The shelves were cluttered with small wooden drawers, dusty jars, and wax-sealed vials. Each one held something mysterious: crushed bone, powdered antler, dried beetles, or strange combinations of known and unknown substances. Ambergris, saltpeter, myrrh, snakeskin, mummy dust. The apothecary would listen patiently, nodding as the patient described their troubles. No symptoms were dismissed. Dreams were considered. The time of day mattered, the weather, the mood in the home. And then the mixing would begin. Medicines were not pre-packaged. They were composed by hand, measured on delicate bone scales, ground on smooth stone slabs, stirred into honey or thick syrup, or wrapped in cloth to be steeped like tea. There was no universal dose, no standardized label, only instinct, practice, and intuition. The right remedy for one person might harm another. That was understood. Some prescriptions included instructions that felt more like ritual than medicine. Boil this before sunrise, a note might say. Drink only when the moon is waning. Bury the remainder beneath a rowan tree. Whether these steps were truly believed to be medicinal or were simply part of tradition is hard to know now. But they were followed because healing meant respect for both the body and the invisible forces that might afflict it. Mental distress was treated differently, though not always kindly. If a patient wept without reason, heard voices, or trembled without visible cause, healers might first offer calming herbs, chamomile, lemon balm, valerian root. If these failed, prayers were written on parchment and worn close to the skin. Small bells were rung in the corners of the room. Holy water was sprinkled on pillows and behind doors. Mirrors were placed beside the patient's bed in the hope that the spirit of the illness might be tricked, fooled into seeing no one home. More serious disturbances sometimes led to harsh measures: isolation, silence, vigils held at the bedside. In the worst cases, exorcism. These were rare and feared, and often misunderstood. But behind each act, whether gentle or cruel, was usually a wish to help, even if the method was flawed. In villages far from formal knowledge, the work of healing often fell to those with no titles at all. A woman with a sharp gaze and a memory of 100 plants. A man who could feel the shift of a broken bone beneath the skin. These were the bone setters, the herb wives, the wise folk. They learned not from books, but from generations, from watching, from tending, from stories passed at the hearth. They knew which moss drew out infection, which bark soothed a restless stomach, which flower to steep when dreams turned dark. They worked not from prescriptions, but from presence. And when a patient grew well, it was not just the plant or the poultice they remembered, but the human being who stayed by their side, who wrapped the wound, stirred the broth, whispered calm into a fevered mind, because healing was not sterile, not simple, not safe, but it was full of care, and often that was enough. For every cure that soothed the sick, there were others that demanded courage. Treatments so intense, so deeply unsettling by modern standards, that they reveal just how far people were willing to go for even the faintest chance at recovery. Let us walk slowly into that darker space, where healing bordered on harm and desperation met belief. Bloodletting remained a staple of medieval treatment, but in its more extreme forms it became almost ritualistic. Physicians didn't simply cut and wait. They consulted detailed diagrams that mapped the veins of the body according to the stars. Astrology was not a superstition, it was a guide. Each body part corresponded to a zodiac sign. Each illness had a celestial influence. If a patient suffered from an inflamed liver under the wrong alignment of Mars, the cut might be delayed. To bleed without reading the heavens was to act blindly. These diagrams, called zodiac men, were drawn with exquisite care. They showed the human form overlaid with the cosmos, stars circling the limbs, signs assigned to organs. A healer might consult one before opening a vein behind the ear for fever, or at the ankle to relieve melancholia. Sometimes, even the colour and consistency of the blood was studied, its story read in streaks of darkness or clarity. Other methods of drawing blood included cupping, a practice that used small glass or horn cups, heated briefly, then placed on the skin. As the air cooled, it created suction, pulling blood to the surface. In some cases, the skin was lightly pricked beforehand, so blood rose into the cups themselves. The resulting welts were seen as signs of the body releasing trapped illness. It was not uncommon for these sessions to leave circular bruises across the back or limbs, which were considered marks of healing. Leeches were also kept at hand, stored in damp jars near the hearth or in shadowed corners of the apothecary's shelves. They were prized for their precision, gentle, controlled, and able to reach delicate places that a knife could not, behind the eyes, along the temples, even beneath the tongue. A skilled healer knew just how long to let the leech feed, when to remove it, how to coax it off gently without harm. Some believed leeches could sense imbalances and would find the right place to latch without instruction. But bleeding was not the only method that bordered on the dangerous. In rare and desperate cases, there was trepanation, the act of boring a small hole into the skull. It was used to treat seizures, persistent pain, or behaviors that defied understanding. The healer would use a circular hand drill, slowly turning it against the bone until it gave way. There was no true anesthesia, only strong drink, biting leather, whispered prayers, and the resolve to endure. Remarkably, some survived. A few even healed fully, their skulls showing clean regrowth around the open space. To modern eyes, it seems impossible, but evidence remains, in bones unearthed from ancient graves, in quiet histories passed down by word of mouth. Other painful cures were used for what we now understand as mental illness. Hot irons were applied to the skin, sometimes to the scalp itself. This was not done from cruelty, but from belief that the heat might drive out the demon or burn away the source of torment. Healers might also blister the skin deliberately, believing the raised welts could draw sickness to the surface. And if a patient was gripped by voices or visions, some would suggest tying iron around the limbs or carrying heavy stones to ground the body. Labour, too, came with its own fears. A woman in childbirth was seen as walking the line between life and death. If the child refused to come, the midwife might whisper charms or prayers while untying knots in her own clothing, a symbolic gesture meant to unbind the womb. Knives and bread were placed under the bed, symbols of strength and sustenance. If the delivery became dangerous, a priest might be called to bless the room. And if a child was stillborn, baptism by proxy was performed quickly, sometimes with water touched to the mother's brow. Miscarriage was wrapped in silence, but not neglect. A lost child might be buried with rosemary, or wrapped in cloth once used in prayer. The grief was immense, and so the ritual was precise. These difficult treatments, strange as they may seem now, were acts of faith. The pain was not the goal, it was a price, and always behind the methods there was care. A mother begging for her child's breath, a healer sitting through the night, waiting for a moan, a twitch, a sign. In those moments, the tools were sharp, the chances slim, but a will to heal remained steady. And when the patient did recover, their body carried the memory, a scar, a mark, a story, not of violence, but of effort, not of madness, but of trying. and sometimes that was enough. Not all remedies of the medieval healer were soft and fragrant. Some were harsh, frightening even. They weren't designed for comfort. They were for when the body broke down completely, when the fever rose too high, or when pain refused to leave. In those moments, more drastic measures were taken. Acts of medicine that walked the edge between help and harm, between science and desperation. Bloodletting was one of the most common and feared of these treatments. It was believed that too much blood, or blood gone stagnant, could flood the body with heat or bad humors. So a healer might take a sharp lancet and cut a vein, usually at the arm or ankle, sometimes behind the ear. The blood would pour out, carefully collected in a bowl. Its flow was watched, its color examined. Was it too thick, too dark? Did it smell wrong? These clues were thought to reveal the nature of the illness inside. There were rules to follow. Some insisted on odd quantities, 7 ounces, 9 or 11. Others followed the lunar calendar, only bleeding during certain phases of the moon. And once the bleeding was finished, the patient was wrapped in wool, given spiced wine, and told to sleep. Many did feel relief, perhaps from lowered pressure, perhaps from the act itself, which offered a sense of order amid chaos. But bloodletting was not always safe. Too much could leave a patient too weak to recover. And when bloodletting failed, there was the leech. Leeches were kept in cool jars beside apothecary shelves, small, slimy, and patient. They were applied to delicate areas where knives would be too risky, like the temples, the fingers, or near the eyes. Once attached, the leech would begin to draw blood. Slow, painless, persistent. When it had its fill, it would fall off, its body swollen and red. Some physicians considered leeches more elegant than blades, less traumatic, more refined. And strangely, leeches have made a quiet return in modern medicine for the same reasons, reducing blood pressure, encouraging circulation, and easing tissue congestion. But the strangest and perhaps most terrifying treatment was trepanation. It sounds mythical, but it was real. In extreme cases, when someone heard voices no one else could hear or suffered seizures without cause, a hole might be drilled into the skull, not to extract anything, not to insert, but to release, to let out the pressure, the spirit, the evil. This procedure was ancient. Traces of it are found in Stone Age remains. In medieval times it was rare, but not unheard of. A hand drill or chisel would be turned slowly, methodically, while the patient was either restrained or numbed only by wine and prayer. There was no antiseptic, no pain relief, save perhaps a strip of leather to bite. But some lived, some even improved, and their skulls would heal around the hole, leaving behind proof that they had survived both the sickness and the cure. Other treatments, though less invasive, were just as strange. Toads were tied to the body, alive, to draw out fever. When the toad died, it was believed the illness had left the host. Roosters were passed over the sick and then buried. Eels were placed at the foot of the bed. Knives under pillows, mirrors beside beds, salt in doorways. These were gestures to confuse illness, to disorient spirits, or to symbolically cut ties with the source of pain. When the plague came, all of this intensified. The Black Death spread faster than understanding could follow. People burned sweet-smelling herbs in the streets. They carried pomanders, tiny metal orbs filled with cloves, rosemary, or ambergris, held close to the nose to ward off poisoned air. Others rubbed their bodies with vinegar or onions, wore amulets, fled towns, or isolated themselves in stone towers. Desperate cures emerged. People drank crushed emeralds mixed with wine. They self-flagellated to beg divine forgiveness. Some even shaved their heads and bathed in milk, believing it would protect them. These treatments rarely worked, but they gave people something to do, something to hold on to. Still, not all of it was folly. Some remedies, honey packed into wounds, garlic steeped in oil, willow bark chewed for pain, offered real relief, real healing. The line between superstition and wisdom was thin, but it was there. Even when no cure worked, the healer did not give up. They stayed, tried again, or simply spoke gently beside the patient. Because healing wasn't always about success. Sometimes it was about presence, about the belief that doing something, anything, was better than silence, better than fear. In this, the medieval world was both strange and profoundly human. Every poultice, every chant, every bitter root, each one carried hope wrapped in mystery. And sometimes that was enough. Healing in the home was personal, intimate, and deeply rooted in the habits of daily life. Long before a learned physician arrived, if one ever did, the first response to sickness came from those nearest: family, neighbors, the person who shared the hearth. It was a care built not on doctrine, but on instinct and repetition. The house became both cradle and clinic, a warm basin placed beside the bed, clean cloths folded and steeped in chamomile tea, broth simmered low, infused with garlic and thyme. Every motion was simple: boiling water, adjusting blankets, cooling a forehead with the back of the hand. But behind each act was quiet knowledge, often passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. Each household had its remembered cures: a spoonful of honey for a sore throat, bread soaked in warm milk and laid across a bruised limb, onion placed at the foot of the bed to draw out fevers. These weren't written down, but they were trusted. Some were taught in whispers, others demonstrated by example. A young child might watch their grandmother hang nettle by the door or place sprigs of lavender near the window, not just for scent, but because it was believed to keep bad humors at bay. Herbs were stored in cupboards, hung in bundles near the rafters, tied with twine and labeled in memory, not ink. Some homes had jars of dried fennel, yarrow, or sage. Others relied on what grew just outside the door. Dandelion roots, dug in the early spring, were thought to purify the blood. In summer, calendula petals were steeped in oil and rubbed onto cracked hands. And in winter, a drink made from warmed vinegar, honey, and a pinch of clove might be served to chase out chills. Healing rituals emerged from routine. Bread dough was sometimes marked with symbols before baking. Beds were turned clockwise to realign the body's energy. A knife placed under a pillow might be said to cut through dreams that brought sickness. A comb passed through hair 3 times before sleep, once for the mind, once for the heart, once for the spirit. Sound, too, played its part. Not loud incantations, but gentle hums. A lullaby altered to include the name of a saint. A whispered charm spoken as water was poured over the hands. Even silence had its role, a form of presence, of saying, "You are not alone," without needing to speak. In many families, someone emerged as the quiet watcher. They were not chosen formally, but they stayed up through the night, noticed when the breath changed, when the skin grew warm. They brewed the teas no one else remembered how to make. They laid hands gently on aching joints. They remembered to turn the mattress when the fever rose. household care was not only herbal, it was practical. The room was swept, the linens aired, shoes placed neatly side by side, not from tidiness, but to remind the soul where it belonged. A bit of salt was scattered near doorways. Smoke from dried rosemary was waved into the corners, especially after an illness passed, to clear what lingered unseen. Children learned by watching. They helped tie herb bundles. They tasted bitter brews and were told, "This one is for your belly." They knew which cup was the sick cup. They knew which corner of the garden held plants never to be eaten raw. In this way, healing knowledge passed forward, not as a lesson, but as life itself. The sickbed was not a place of helplessness. It was a place of transformation. The rhythms of care slowed everything. A candle burned softly nearby. Meals were given in small portions. Words were chosen gently. And if the illness deepened, the care did not stop. The cloths were refreshed. A new herb was tried. Sometimes a blessing was added, whispered under the breath while adjusting a pillow. Not every remedy worked, not every illness left. But healing was not only measured in recovery, it was in the act of showing up, sitting beside someone, stirring the broth even when you feared the worst, singing softly even when your voice trembled, and when recovery did come, it arrived quietly. The first full breath, the first sip of water without pain, the first time the sick sat up, looked to the window, and smiled. In those moments, the home exhaled too, and life, slowly, began again. In the deeper corners of healing, far beyond the gentle cups of chamomile and the soft poultices made of honey, there lived stranger cures, more intense, more jarring, more desperate. These treatments were rarely the first choice. They were what one reached for when all else had failed, when hope flickered low but hadn't gone out entirely. They were not for the faint-hearted, and they were not always kind. Consider the heated needle driven into a swollen joint, believed to release the trapped spirit of pain, or the boiled vinegar poured directly onto a festering wound, causing agony, but perhaps, just perhaps, sparing the limb. Some of these methods sound like cruelty now, but in their time they were seen as necessary acts of courage, or at least of grim practicality. One such treatment was known as smoking, not the leisurely kind from clay pipes, but the kind where damp herbs were set alight and the smoke funneled into the body. Hollow reeds were used to blow warmth into the ears, the mouth, or worse, the rectum. The goal was to wake the sluggish organs, or to force out cold, or to dislodge a spirit that had somehow gone into hiding. For those who could not speak, perhaps due to a stroke, or possession, or fright, some healers recommended boiling nettles and applying them to the soles of the feet. The pain, they believed, would shake the voice loose. Others resorted to cold shock, plunging the patient into a river at dawn, praying that the soul would return before the chill took hold. Even childbirth, that most human of agonies, brought its own library of intense rituals. Laboring mothers were sometimes given drinks made from crushed insects or powdered stones. If the birth stalled, the room might be fumigated with burned hair or feathers. A charm might be pressed into the woman's palm, a smooth stone etched with a spiral, a word, a plea. To stop bleeding, some used pressure, others flame. A red-hot poker applied near the wound, never touching it directly, was thought to startle the body into clotting. In certain villages, this practice evolved into the belief that pain could distract the soul from death. redirect its attention even for just a moment. Then there were the creatures, not metaphors, real ones. A spider mashed into paste and applied to a boil. Frogs tied alive to the throat to treat mumps. Earthworms soaked in wine and sipped slowly to ease internal pain. One method even involved placing a live mole against the belly, believing its burrowing nature would coax a stubborn illness to move. These treatments were rarely universal. In one town, they might swear by hot coals placed near the ribs to treat pneumonia. In another, the same illness would be treated with cold compresses and long silences. What they shared was a willingness to act, even when understanding was limited, because underneath these oddities was a kind of logic, primitive, yes, but rooted in experience. They had watched someone survive a terrible fever after being cupped until their back turned purple. They had seen a child stop shaking after being passed through smoke. They didn't know why it worked, only that it might. And when you are watching someone suffer, might is often enough. Many of these remedies were accompanied by ritual, a chant, a pattern of steps around the bed, a gesture traced in the air above the wound. These weren't just performances. They were how belief entered the body. The ritual turned the pain into purpose. The gesture gave structure to fear. Even silence had its place. In some practices, a healer would simply sit by the patient, hold a burning herb in one hand, and wait. Not speaking, not moving, only watching, letting the presence itself do the work. Sometimes an item was left under the pillow, a black stone, a bit of cloth soaked in salt water. These small, strange tokens were not always explained, but they were never left without meaning. And when all else failed, there was fire. Cauterization was not only for open wounds. In some places, it was used to treat seizures, a quick press of a heated rod to the back or neck. Not to burn deeply, but to jolt the nerves, to send a message to whatever part of the body had stopped listening. Some might say these were acts of desperation, but desperation, too, is a kind of knowledge. It teaches what gentler times forget, that sometimes healing must be loud, must be frightening, must be endured. There is dignity in trying, even when the means are harsh. There is care, even in the scream, because when the illness is strong, the healer must be stronger still. And so they reached for whatever might work, not because they lacked compassion, but because they had too much of it to stand by and do nothing. The apothecary's shop was a world unto itself, a place where scent, texture, and quiet concentration blended into something both scientific and sacred. Unlike the folk healer who worked from home or field, the apothecary lived among drawers and vials, scales and powders, parchments stained with ink and oil. It was a place of structure, yet still touched by mystery. To step into one of these shops was to enter a cabinet of curiosities. Shelves bowed beneath the weight of jars, glass, clay, or horn, each sealed with wax and labelled in Latin or old dialect. There were roots twisted into strange shapes, dried insects arranged like charms, barks and bones and blossoms all turned from wild to remedy by the work of the apothecary's hands. The air was thick with scent, not always pleasant, but always vivid. Bitter myrrh and sweet marjoram, musty valerian, acrid brimstone, crushed lavender, crushed beetles. One couldn't walk through without inhaling the past, each jar a memory, each scent a symptom, each mixture a gamble between balance and risk. Apothecaries did not merely stock supplies, they made them. Behind the counter, a mortar rested on a slab of stone, forever dusted with fragments of herbs and minerals. The pestle, darkened from years of use, moved in slow, circular rhythm. Crush, fold, stir. It was not just preparation, it was ritual, a dance of repetition and intention. Measuring was done by weight, not volume. Tiny scales hung from iron frames, their chains delicate, their counterweights hand-carved. Powders were laid gently, like snowfall, and adjusted grain by grain. When the measure was right, it was mixed with honey, or stirred into oil, or folded into parchment to be brewed later into tea. There was aesthetic to it, a kind of alchemy of the senses. Powders were tinted yellow or red, liquids glowed amber or green. A well-made medicine was not only effective, it looked right, smelled right, even sounded right as it was stirred. The ingredients varied wildly. Some were common: mint, rosemary, thyme. Others rare and strange: crushed pearl, ambergris, powdered mummy. The more exotic the ingredient, the more potent it was believed to be. Sometimes that potency was real, sometimes imagined, but always respected. And then there were the compound preparations, the true test of the apothecary's skill. These were not single herbs, but recipes with a dozen parts or more. Electuaries, syrups, plasters, confections. A preparation for the stomach might combine anise, cinnamon, and wormwood, while a balm for pain might include belladonna, vinegar, and beeswax. Each ingredient served a purpose, each in its proper proportion. Some recipes were centuries old, passed down through manuscript and memory. Others were invented on the spot, tailored to a patient's humours, complexion, or season of the year. There was no universal prescription, only patterns, instincts, and accumulated wisdom. Apothecaries served the towns as both healer and merchant. They knew the ailments of every household. They watched for the shift in seasons, the coughs that came with the cold, the fevers that bloomed with spring. Sometimes their shop doubled as a place of quiet counsel. Patients would linger, hesitant, asking not only for medicine but for advice, for reassurance, for a moment of peace. Though apothecaries were often literate, often trained, and often respected, they were not doctors in the formal sense. They walked a line between science and service, between remedy and ritual. Their knowledge was practical, rooted in repetition, and yet, sometimes, it bordered on the mystical. Labels were more than names. They were incantations. Recipes were more than instructions. They were memories of healing captured on paper. Even the act of wrapping a parchment, folding it just so, was a gesture of care. The contrast with folk healing was not absolute, but it was marked. Where the herb wife worked from memory and intuition, the apothecary relied on ratio and formula. Where the village healer infused her teas with prayer, the apothecary counted grains and drops, careful not to exceed. Still, the lines blurred often. An apothecary might add a pinch of ash from a blessed candle. A healer might stop by the shop for prepared elixirs. The world of medicine was not made of absolutes. It was a shared tapestry, stitched with trade, knowledge, and need. The apothecary's shop was part storeroom, part sanctuary, a place where healing was visible, tactile, deliberate. Every item touched by hand, every remedy shaped, not just sourced. And when the shop closed for the night, and the jars were sealed, and the fire burned low beneath the tinctures steeping overnight, there was silence, a stillness that held all the questions unanswered. and all the hope yet to come. In the medieval world, healing and holiness were never far apart. When herbs failed, when fevers rose, and when shadows passed over the eyes, many turned not to the herb wife or the barber surgeon, but to the saints, the relics, and the rituals of faith. The church was more than a place of worship. It was a sanctuary, a hospital, a listening ear, and a final hope. Stone walls echoed with prayers both whispered and wept. Bells marked time, and incense drifted in quiet spirals, lifting supplications skyward. The poor, the broken, and the frightened all came to these sacred spaces when earthly medicine seemed too frail. Every illness had a saint to match. Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows, was called upon during plagues. Saint Apollonia, whose teeth were shattered in martyrdom, was the patron of toothaches. Saint Dymphna, a gentle soul who died protecting her sanity, watched over those tormented in the mind. Saint Roch bore the wounds of the sick, and pilgrims touched his effigies, praying for deliverance. Even obscure saints found their way into folk belief, local martyrs adopted by villages, their stories wrapped around healing wells and crumbling chapels. Offerings filled these holy places. Wax figures shaped like limbs or hearts were left behind, votives of gratitude or plea. A wax foot for a sprain that healed, a tiny ear for restored hearing. These tokens gathered in dusty alcoves, testaments to hope. At the foot of saint statues, people left hair ribbons, scraps of linen, sprigs of thyme, and coins wrapped in string. Not wealth, but devotion. Pilgrimage was another form of healing. For those able to walk, sacred destinations beckoned. Canterbury, Chartres, Santiago de Compostela. The journey itself was the cure. Each mile walked barefoot, each prayer whispered under stars, each blister offered as penance. Some pilgrims tied bells to their cloaks, others carried tokens to be blessed. And when they arrived, they knelt in candlelight, pressing forehead to stone, heart lifted by the promise of relief. Relics were central to belief. These were not mere souvenirs, but bones, cloth, or drops of blood believed to carry divine power. To touch a relic was to touch something beyond time. Churches guarded these fragments, saintly fingers wrapped in silk, wood slivers from the true cross, vials of holy oil. Processions carried them through town during times of sickness. Some healers placed relics near the sick, hoping that proximity might coax the illness to flee. Holy wells dotted the countryside, often linked to a saint's blessing. People bathed in the waters, drank from them, or carried bottles home for loved ones. Nearby trees, called clouty trees, bore strips of fabric soaked in hope. As the fabric faded in the wind, so too, it was believed, would the illness. Faith was not separate from medicine. The most learned physicians still prayed before treating the body. They sprinkled holy water on compresses. They recited psalms while grinding herbs, not because they dismissed science, but because they recognized its limits. A poultice could soothe, but a prayer could console. Some healers spoke Latin blessings while wrapping wounds. Others traced the sign of the cross over fevers. Families lit candles at home, reciting old rhymes as they stirred broth. Even the placement of a bed mattered, aligned so the ill might face east toward the rising sun and the hope of healing. Exorcisms were rare, but not unheard of. When an illness defied explanation, when the body twisted, or the voice changed, or fear lingered without cause, some believed a spirit was at fault. A priest might be summoned, holy words spoken, incense burned. the body shaken, not by fever, but by fear and faith entwined. Not all faith healing was dramatic. Much of it was quiet. A token worn around the neck, a prayer sewn into the lining of a tunic, a psalm whispered before sleep. These rituals comforted more than they cured, but comfort was itself a form of medicine. Even those without access to relics or pilgrimage found ways to invoke the sacred. A handful of dirt from a churchyard, placed beneath a sickbed, a crucifix made from twigs, a hymn sung gently while dabbing sweat from a brow. The line between prayer and cure blurred. Each became part of the same gesture of care. In this world, healing was layered: physical, emotional, spiritual, a poultice and a prayer, a remedy and a ritual, not in competition, but in harmony. The soul was not treated after the body, but with it, and though centuries have passed, traces remain. A candle flickering in a quiet chapel, a ribbon tied to a gate, a name whispered in a moment of desperation. These are the echoes of a time when healing and holiness were one, and when to hope was itself a sacred act. Not all illness could be seen, and so not all healing could be named. Across the medieval world, people turned not only to saints or salves, but to protections older than memory, rituals carved into daily life like hidden spells stitched into worn fabric. When reason failed and medicine brought no ease, the invisible was acknowledged: fear, envy, curses, spirits, the pull of the moon. These too required remedies. Some illnesses arrived with no wound, no fever, only silence. A child who no longer laughed, a man who stared too long into nothing, a woman who wept in sleep. These were signs of something deeper, unspoken. People said the soul could be touched by things that passed unseen: a look too sharp, a whisper too bitter, a breeze through the wrong window at the wrong hour. To guard against such forces, homes were warded. Salt was poured across thresholds or kept in small bowls beneath beds, not for taste, but for defense, against spirits, bad dreams, or something nameless. Iron was sacred: a blade beneath a child's crib, a horseshoe above a door. Some carried iron nails in their pockets, rusted smooth by touch. The evil eye was greatly feared. A glance filled with envy could, they believed, spoil milk, sour bread, or bring illness to the body. To defend against it, mothers sewed black beads into their children's clothes. Some healers spat on the ground behind a departing guest. Others tied red thread around wrists and ankles, knots holding prayers unspoken. Herbs had two lives, one for the body and one for the spirit. Mugwort was burned to cleanse rooms. Rue and vervain were steeped, not to drink, but to wash over window sills and lintels. Lavender was tucked into pillowcases to guard dreams. Sage was burned in loops, smoke drawn across doorways to confuse whatever lingered near. Illness without cause might call for deeper ritual. A bowl of water was passed 3 times over the patient's body, then flung into the road at dawn. A candle was lit each night and watched closely. If the flame leaned or flickered strangely, it was believed the illness was watching back. Mirrors were powerful. During a fever, they were covered with cloth. It was said that sickness could recognize itself in reflection and linger. Others placed mirrors at the foot of the bed, hoping to frighten the illness into fleeing, confused by the doubling of the soul. Symbols were drawn in chalk or ash: circles, crosses, spirals. Some were carved into wooden doorposts or etched onto window panes. These were not decorations. They were traps, meant to confuse, delay, or contain. In some villages, children were marked with a pinch of ash behind the ear, or 3 dots of oil pressed into the chest, a quiet shield, barely visible. Names had power. Some believed that if you could name the illness aloud, you could call it out of the body. Others believed names must be hidden, illnesses given nicknames or avoided entirely for fear of summoning them stronger. Wax was molded into tiny limbs or figures, carried into chapels or buried in crossroads. Bread was baked with herbs and fed to animals instead of people, transferring the illness. Sometimes a sick person's shirt was boiled with bitter roots, then hung at the edge of the forest to dry, so the trees might carry the affliction away. Healers watched patterns, a cat refusing to enter a room, a bird tapping once at the window, smoke that refused to rise. These were signs, not to be ignored. Interpretation was a craft all its own. The church, uneasy with these rituals, often forbade them, but in quiet corners and country kitchens, the practices lived on. They weren't rebellion, they were inheritance. An amulet tucked into a sleeve, a rhyme whispered over cooling tea, a thread stitched in secret. These acts were not just superstition, they were how people made sense of what they could not touch, how they loved in the dark, how they resisted helplessness with action, however small. And while the scholar had his books and the priest had his prayers, the healer had these invisible tools: ash, salt, thread, breath. Not for proof, but for comfort. Not for cure, always, but for courage. Even today, in our clean, bright world, some of these remain. We hang charms, we light candles, we touch wood. Not because we believe in magic, perhaps, but because we remember. Somewhere deep, we remember. The world is still mysterious, still vast, still filled with things we cannot see. And still we ward. Still we hope. A healer's hands carried more than herbs and tools. They carried the weight of hope. In every village there was someone, often not chosen, but called, who stayed behind when others stepped away, who leaned close when others feared contagion, who gave what they could, even when nothing more could be done. These were the healers, and while they tended to bodies and soothed spirits, their own burdens often went unspoken. To heal was to carry stories, to witness pain again and again, to watch as fevers took hold, as breathing grew ragged, as strength ebbed with each sunrise. Some patients recovered, and their joy was a balm. Others did not, and their absence clung like ash. The healer remained, scraping bowls clean, rinsing linens, beginning again. Doubt came quietly. It lived in the space between cures, in the sleepless hours after a poultice failed, in the shadow that crossed a healer's face when their patient grew cold. Did I choose the wrong herb? Was the moon in the wrong house? Should I have prayed harder? These questions haunted even the most seasoned. Burnout was not named in those days, but it existed, in trembling hands, in forgotten words, in the healer who sat too long at the hearth, staring at nothing. There were no breaks, no replacements. The village relied on them, even as they frayed. Some coped with ritual. They lit candles not only for the sick, but for themselves. They walked alone into fields and whispered to the wind. They stirred medicines with songs hummed low, not for power, but for peace. They sought solitude in chapels or woods, asking no questions, expecting no answers. Others found strength in small things, the touch of a child's hand, the scent of rosemary crushed beneath their fingers, a letter of thanks, poorly spelled but heartfelt, a loaf of bread left on the windowsill in winter. These gestures did not heal them, but they reminded them why they stayed. Healers were often seen as strong, otherworldly, even strange. But inside, they carried the same fears as everyone else. They feared failure. They feared being wrong. They feared becoming sick themselves, and worse, having no one left to care for them. And yet, they rarely spoke of it. Strength was expected, and so they gave it, even when it cost them. Some healers wrote their doubts into margins of herbals, tiny notes. This failed. Try less mint. Patient did not return, as though marking the page might unburden the mind. Others carved symbols into wood, not for the patient, but for themselves. Protection turned inward. There were moments of grace, a wound that closed cleanly, a fever that broke with the morning, a child's first smile after days of silence. In these moments, the healer felt not power, but relief, gratitude, a quiet exhale. And still, doubt returned. Not every day, but often enough. Faith helped some, belief that their hands were guided, that their efforts, though imperfect, were part of something larger. They saw healing as service, not just to the body, but to life itself. Others found solace in the earth, in the rhythm of roots and seasons, the promise that what dies may feed something yet to come. Some burned out completely. They walked away, took up farming or weaving, closed their doors and refused knocks. The village spoke of them in hushed tones. Once a great healer, they said, and perhaps they were, but even healers need healing. Even givers reach empty, and a few, a rare few, endured. Not through magic or training or luck, but through love. A love not loud or grand, but steady. A love for the work, for the people, for the chance, even slim, that their presence mattered. They learned to pace themselves, to sleep when they could, to cry when they must, to laugh even now and then, at chickens who stole herbs or patients who insisted beer was a cure-all. Laughter, too, was medicine. They knew they could not save everyone, but they could bear witness. They could ease suffering. They could carry light into the room, even if only a flicker. And sometimes that was enough. The healer's path was not lined with praise. There were no garlands, no titles, only worn hands, only tired eyes, only the quiet satisfaction of having tried. And so they kept going, into the next day, the next fever, the next cry in the night. Because though the healer was human, fragile, fallible, afraid, they chose again and again to care. And in that choice, they found their own kind of healing. Not all those who were cared for found their way back to health. Not every wound could be closed, nor every fever coaxed into breaking. But still they were tended, with the same dedication, the same softness, the same unwavering hope. Because even when healing failed, care did not. When death came, whether as a quiet exhale or a sudden gasp, it was not treated as a failure, but as a threshold. The healer remained present. A hand was held. A brow was smoothed. A final prayer was spoken with quiet reverence, sometimes aloud, sometimes only within the heart. Death was not to be feared, but witnessed, accompanied. The body, once the home of pain and breath and dreams, was treated with the same attention given to the living. It was washed with warm water. Herbs were placed gently at the feet, lavender, rosemary, hyssop, not only for scent, but for memory. A cloth folded beneath the chin, eyelids closed, not with force, but with care, as if tucking them into sleep. These were the rituals of letting go, not prescribed by doctrine alone, but shaped by time, by region, by personal belief. Some laid coins on the eyes, a passage fee for the soul's journey. Others left a piece of bread on the windowsill, a final meal for whatever might come to collect. Sometimes the healer stayed long after the last breath, cleaning the tools, washing the cloths, whispering to the silence. This too was part of the work, not just tending the ill, but holding the space that illness left behind. And yet, many did recover, slowly, unevenly, in fits and starts. And when they did, they remembered. They remembered the voice that read old stories when their mind wandered, the hand that stirred broth through the long hours, the healer who crossed muddy fields in freezing rain, not for payment, but for duty, or perhaps for love. The small gestures remained etched in memory, the warm cloth draped across the forehead, the bitter tea sweetened only at the end, the silence held when words would not come. These were not forgotten. Over time, what had once been care became tradition, a practice passed down from hand to hand, a daughter watching her mother grind herbs, a son learning to fold linens in quiet corners, neighbors trading tales of old cures, old visits, old kindnesses. The names of plants faded. The exact methods were sometimes lost, but the rhythm of care remained. The pause, the presence, the willingness to sit without answers. These formed a legacy deeper than medicine. And so, the memory of healing continued, not through books, but through gesture, through kitchen whispers and fire-lit stories, through a certain way of folding cloth or holding a hand or waiting with patience for breath to even out. Some healers grew old in this work. Their hands grew slower, but no less sure. Their voices deepened, but retained the same calm. They passed their knowledge without ceremony, only the quiet trust that someone else would remember. They had seen both ends of the thread, the struggle toward life and the gentle fading away, and in both they had remained. The world around them changed. Empires rose and fell. Plagues came and went. But the act of care, the decision to sit beside pain and not flee, held its shape. Even grief became part of the work. For every loss, the healer mourned, but also remembered. They learned the names of those they had helped, the stories, the faces. Sometimes they kept tokens, a ribbon, a bead, a scrap of parchment with a favorite prayer. They did not expect to be remembered, but they remembered. And in this remembering, they honored those who had passed. Care, in this way, was not a transaction. It was a form of devotion. And perhaps this is what healing meant, more than herbs or salves or charms, the unwavering willingness to witness pain, to accompany it, to soften its edges, whether it yielded to comfort or not. It was not glamorous, it was not always successful, but it was constant. And in a world where so much could not be controlled, this constancy mattered. And so the healer carried on, with hands that had held fevered skin and still hearts, with eyes that had watched suffering and survived it, with a voice trained not just in instruction, but in presence. And when the time came for their own rest, someone else would take up the thread. Another voice, another hand, another heart willing to tend the weary. And thus, the memory of care did not end. It continued, not loud, not celebrated, but steady, like breath. And now, dear listener, the fire grows low. The embers have dimmed, and the house is still. You have journeyed through rooms of grief and care, through sickness and recovery, through fear and the quiet resilience that meets it. You've seen the healer's hands, worn and steady, You've heard their thoughts, quiet and unsure, yet always returning to hope. You've sat at the edge of straw beds, beneath rafters lined with herbs, near walls that whispered prayers once forgotten. And now it is time to rest, because rest was always part of healing. It was the beginning and the end. It came after the poultice was tied, after the prayer was said, after the fever broke. It came in the hush of a candle-lit room, in the folding of cloth, in the silence shared between one soul and another, in the trust that nothing more needed to be done. For now, in the Middle Ages, rest was not idleness. It was a kind of agreement between the body and the healer, between the sick and the world. It was an acknowledgement that healing does not happen all at once, but in small, unseen turns, in quiet hours, in deep breaths, in the loosening of tension held too long. They believed that healing might begin when the body was no longer resisting, when it was allowed to soften, to sleep, to slip into the space where time does not push, where nothing is demanded and no answer is needed. Sometimes a window was left open, even in winter, to let the soul breathe. A small breeze might pass over the sleeping form, carrying dreams in its wake. Somewhere between wakefulness and slumber, they believed, the body remembered itself, rebalanced its humours, whispered to its wounds, "You are safe now." And even today, that belief remains. We may no longer crush herbs with stone. We may no longer wear charms on thread or light candles for saints, but we still believe, in our own quiet ways, that healing requires stillness, that care takes time, that rest is not something to be earned, but something we are owed, simply because we have endured. Your bed tonight may not be filled with straw, nor your room scented with rosemary, but still the thread continues. The same breath that once filled the lungs of those long gone now fills yours. The same quiet hope, the same wish for ease. You are not so different from those who came before. They too feared the unknown. They too longed for comfort, for understanding, for relief. They too lay still beneath blankets, staring into the flicker of firelight, hoping that morning would come with gentler hands. And you now lie in that same lineage, of the tended, of the remembered. Healing does not need to be grand. It does not always arrive with ceremony or clarity. Sometimes it comes in the smallest of things, a sip of water, a breath that no longer catches, a night without fear. So let this be that night. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let your thoughts grow quiet. Let the air around you soften. Let your body trust, just for a while, that it is allowed to rest, that there is nothing left to do, no questions to answer, no expectations to meet. Only this moment, only this breath, only this place where healing begins, not through action, but through stillness. You are part of a long, unbroken thread. From the folk healer bending beside a straw mattress, to the apothecary weighing powdered herbs by candlelight, to the grandmother humming as she folds cloth, this thread winds gently through time and now wraps quietly around you. You have heard their stories, you have walked their path, and now you may sleep. The world can wait. Tonight you are being looked after, not by saints perhaps, nor by charms hung from rafters, but by something equally ancient, by rest itself, by silence, by care. Good night.